Marcello Cray stood alone in the corner of Grand Central Terminal on Christmas Eve, a man who controlled half of Manhattan's underworld, but couldn't escape the question a 6-year-old was about to ask him. Thousands of strangers rushed past like water flowing around a stone, none recognizing the carefully controlled danger in the expensive suit, none seeing the emptiness he wore beneath the black wool coat that remained buttoned despite the terminal's heated interior. The silver watch on his wrist, a ghost from 5 years ago, caught the light from the constellation painted across the famous ceiling above, marking time he'd spent running from everything that mattered until he had nowhere left to run. He'd chosen this particular bench deliberately, tucked near the tall arched windows where falling snow created hypnotic patterns against the glass. Far enough from the main concourse that casual passers-by wouldn't attempt conversation or recognition. The next train to anywhere wouldn't depart for another 40 minutes, assuming the worsening storm didn't cancel it entirely like the departure board suggested was increasingly likely. Families clustered around him like islands in a human sea, parents corralling excited children who pointed at decorations strung between classical columns. Everyone seemed tethered to someone else, connected by invisible threads of belonging that Marcello had severed or lost, depending on which version of his history he chose to believe. His tailored suit marked him as someone important, which in his world meant someone to avoid unless business demanded otherwise. The announcement system crackled with another delay notice, the metallic voice apologizing for inconveniences caused by unprecedented weather conditions. Marcello noted with grim satisfaction that his train had just been pushed back another 30 minutes, extending his limbo between the life he was fleeing and whatever waited at the other end. He preferred this in-between space lately, these moments of suspension where neither past nor future could make demands. That's when he noticed the small figure approaching, weaving between travelers with the determination of someone on a mission despite standing barely 3 feet tall. The boy wore a blue puffy coat that made him look wider than he was tall, a red and white striped goro sitting crooked on soft brown curls. Green dinosaur backpack bounced against his shoulders with each step toward Marcello's isolated bench. The child clutched a teddy bear with one button eye hanging by a thread, holding it against his chest, the way soldiers held rifles in hostile territory. His cheeks were flushed pink from the cold that seeped through the terminal's tall windows, and his eyes, impossibly large and round, fixed on Marcello with curiosity that hadn't yet learned to fear strangers in expensive suits. He stopped directly in front of the bench, close enough that Marcello could see tiny marshmallow stains on the boy's puffy sleeves. "No one came with you?" The question emerged with devastating innocence. 6 words that cut through Marcello's carefully constructed armor, like a blade finding the gap between ribs. The boy's voice carried genuine curiosity rather than pity or judgment, just a child noticing another person alone in a sea of togetherness. Around them, the terminal's chaos continued. Rolling suitcases, echoing announcements, 1,000 conversations bleeding into ambient noise. But somehow, this moment felt suspended, separate. Marcello had survived ambushes, betrayals, and territory wars without flinching, but this 6-year-old with a dinosaur backpack had stopped him completely. He could have ignored the question, could have given a dismissive response that would send the child back to wherever he'd come from. Instead, he found himself meeting those round eyes that reflected the golden light strung across the terminal like captured stars, seeing something familiar in their depths. "No," Marcello heard himself say, the word emerging rougher than intended, scraped raw from a throat that spent most days issuing orders, rather than engaging in conversation. "No one came with me." The admission felt strange, almost transgressive, because men in his position didn't acknowledge isolation to strangers, especially not to children who asked uncomfortable questions. But something about this boy's directness demanded honesty instead of the polished lies Marcello usually deployed. The child nodded with a solemnity that seemed borrowed from someone much older, wisdom beyond his years etched in the way he accepted this information without surprise. "Me neither," he said simply, as if loneliness was just another weather condition to endure, rather than a state requiring explanation or apology. He shifted the teddy bear to his other arm and gestured toward the empty space beside Marcello on the bench with his free hand. "Can I sit here? My legs are tired from walking around looking." The request came without fear or hesitation, just practical need, meeting available solution. Marcello found himself nodding before his brain caught up with the decision, moving his coat slightly to make room even as his rational mind questioned what he was doing. The boy climbed onto the bench with the awkward determination of someone whose feet didn't quite touch the ground when seated. He settled in beside Marcello, the dinosaur backpack crinkling as it compressed against the bench's wooden slats, the teddy bear positioned carefully on his lap, where it could see the terminal's activity. Up close, Marcello noticed details that distance had obscured: the careful patches on the bear's worn fur, the way the boy's coat was slightly too large in the sleeves, evidence of hand-me-downs and careful budgeting that Marcello recognized from memories he usually kept buried under decades of acquired wealth. "I'm Kit," the boy announced, extending his small hand with a formality that suggested someone had taught him proper introductions mattered even in improper circumstances. His fingers disappeared into Marcello's palm, the handshake brief but earnest, carrying warmth that made Marcello suddenly aware of how cold his own hands had become. The simple gesture, unchanged since humanity invented greeting rituals, somehow felt profound in this context of mutual aloneness. "Marcello," he replied, his name sounding foreign in his own ears because it had been reduced to Mr. Cray, or Boss, in most contexts for years now. Kit tested the name silently, lips moving without sound, committing it to memory the way children did with information they deemed important. Then he adjusted his position on the bench, swinging his legs slightly because they dangled well above the marble floor, creating a rhythm that suggested this was familiar waiting rather than temporary pause. "This is Mr. Buttons," Kit continued, lifting the teddy bear slightly for formal introduction, as if worn stuffed animals deserved the same courtesy as human strangers. "He doesn't talk much, but he's a really good listener, which Miss Linley says is more important anyway." The reverence in the boy's voice when he mentioned this, Miss Linley suggested she occupied a crucial space in his small universe. Marcello found himself wondering who she was: mother, guardian, someone else, and why she wasn't here. The storm outside intensified while they sat together, snow now falling in sheets that obscured the city lights beyond the terminal's famous windows. Weather reports scrolling across digital boards predicted accumulation measured in feet rather than inches, dangerous travel conditions that would strand thousands in this architectural cathedral. Kit seemed unbothered by the worsening weather, as if being trapped and delayed was just another feature of his existence, rather than unexpected complication. He pulled his backpack around to his front and unzipped the main compartment with focused concentration, small fingers working the zipper with practiced efficiency. From inside, he produced a slightly crushed packet of dinosaur-shaped graham crackers and a thermos covered in faded superhero stickers, the kind of provisions someone packs for a child expecting to wait. Without preamble or negotiation, Kit offered both items to Marcello, extending them across the space between them like precious gifts, rather than convenience store snacks. "I was saving these for later, but I think later is now," Kit explained, his logic simultaneously childish and irrefutable, the kind of reasoning that made perfect sense within its own framework. "Miss Linley says sharing makes everything taste better anyway, even the dinosaur crackers from the dollar store that sometimes break wrong." The boy's matter-of-fact tone suggested he'd learned not to expect premium provisions, that broken crackers and dollar store supplies were standard rather than disappointment. Marcello accepted a cracker shaped like a stegosaurus, its tail broken off but its essential dinosaurness intact. The sweetness hit his tongue, cheap processed graham flour and too much sugar, tasting nothing like the carefully prepared meals his chef produced. Kit watched him eat with the satisfied expression of someone whose generosity had been properly received. The boy unscrewed the thermos cap and poured hot chocolate into the small cup attached to the top, steam rising in delicate spirals. He took a careful sip before offering it to Marcello with the casual trust of someone who hadn't yet learned that strangers could be dangerous. "Miss Linley made it this morning," Kit said, his voice carrying warmth. "She puts extra marshmallows because she knows I like the melty ones." The chocolate was lukewarm now, sweetness diluted by time, and melted marshmallows turned to sugary foam on the surface. But Marcello drank from the offered cup anyway. Something about refusing would have felt like rejecting more than just a beverage, like breaking some unspoken code of this unexpected alliance. Kit reclaimed the cup and took another sip, leaving a faint chocolate mustache on his upper lip that he wiped away with his coat sleeve. Around them, Grand Central Terminal continued its evening chaos, with travelers hurrying toward platforms that might still be operational. Families clustered around departure boards that flickered with increasingly dire cancellation notices, phones emerging from pockets as people scrambled to make alternative arrangements. Holiday music played from speakers somewhere overhead, cheerful melodies that felt incongruous against the growing anxiety rippling through the stranded masses. Kit seemed to exist in a bubble separate from the surrounding chaos, as if delays and disappointments were such standard features of his existence that he'd learned to find peace within them. He offered Marcello another cracker, a triceratops this time, and pointed toward the massive windows where snow continued its relentless assault. "It's pretty, though," the boy said, finding beauty in the storm that was trapping them all. "Like the snow globes Miss Linley has on her desk that you shake and everything goes white and quiet." Marcello followed the child's gaze, seeing through Kit's eyes for a moment instead of his own jaded perspective that had stopped noticing beauty. The snow did look like a globe someone had shaken, the flakes dancing in patterns that seemed choreographed by invisible hands. The usual neon aggression of New York had been muted under white blankets, buildings becoming gentle shapes instead of concrete declarations. "How long have you been here?" Marcello asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Kit scrunched his face in concentration, the kind of thinking expression children make when trying to count something important. He looked at the famous clock above the information booth, its 4 faces showing the same relentless march toward evening. Since the big hand was on the 12, and the small hand was on the 3, Kit said finally, demonstrating the lesson someone had taught him about reading analog time. 3 hours. This child had been waiting for 3 hours in one of the busiest terminals in the world, apparently unnoticed by the thousands who'd passed by. Marcello felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "Who are you waiting for?" The question came out more gently than Marcello usually spoke, his voice losing the edge that made associates flinch. Kit adjusted Mr. Buttons on his lap, smoothing down the bear's matted fur with careful fingers that suggested this was a soothing ritual. His answer came with the rehearsed quality of something he'd been told to remember, instructions drilled in before being left. "Miss Linley had to do paperwork at the office, but she said she'd come get me before the trains stop running." The boy's faith in this promise was absolute, untouched by the reality that trains had already stopped running and the designated meeting time had clearly passed. He swung his legs against the bench, sneakers lighting up with each movement, little flashes of red and blue in the dimming terminal. "She always comes back. Sometimes it just takes longer than she thinks it will." The careful optimism in Kit's voice, practiced brightness covering deeper worry, reminded Marcello of soldiers who kept talking during ambushes to convince themselves they'd survive the next few minutes. This child had learned to wait, to trust that eventually someone would return, to fill empty hours with small rituals and forced cheer. The dinosaur crackers, the lukewarm chocolate, the teddy bear position just so, all strategies for enduring abandonment even if temporary. "Does Miss Linley know about the storm?" Marcello heard himself asking, already reaching for his phone before consciously deciding to get involved. Kit nodded vigorously, curls bouncing under the crooked goro, eager to defend the absent adult who'd left him here. His explanation tumbled out with the kind of detail children provide when they've been thinking about something for hours, turning it over in their minds. "She called the terminal phone and they made an announcement for me to stay right here by the big windows." Kit pointed toward the information desk, where a harried employee was currently dealing with 3 angry travelers simultaneously. "She said not to move anywhere else because that's where she'd look for me first, and I'm good at staying put." The pride in his voice at being good at staying put broke something in Marcello that he'd thought was beyond breaking. The terminal had grown more crowded as the storm worsened, people giving up on departures and settling in for an unexpected night in the station. Families were staking out territory near outlets, unrolling sleeping bags purchased from the overpriced gift shop, children running between columns despite parents' exhausted protests. Kit watched this settling in process with interest, but no apparent desire to join, content in his designated spot beside Marcello. "Are you waiting for a train too?" Kit asked, redirecting attention with the conversational skill of someone used to managing social situations beyond his years. His question was genuine curiosity rather than polite deflection, those round eyes fixed on Marcello's face. The boy had shared his crackers and his hot chocolate and his spot on the bench, so apparently now he wanted to collect information in return, fair trade in the economy of connection. "I was," Marcello admitted, glancing at the departure board where his train had shifted from delayed to canceled in red letters. Not anymore. The acknowledgement should have brought frustration or disappointment, but instead he felt something closer to relief, as if the universe had made a decision he'd been avoiding. There was nowhere he needed to be, no one waiting for his arrival, just the hollow motion of going somewhere to avoid staying here. Kit absorbed this information with a thoughtful nod, then reached into his backpack again and produced a coloring book and a Ziploc bag of crayons. "Miss Linley packed these in case I got bored," he explained. opening to a page featuring dinosaurs and a prehistoric landscape. Do you want to color? The Stegosaurus still needs its plates done, and I'm not very good at staying inside the lines. The invitation was offered with the same casual generosity as the crackers, as if sharing activities was as natural as breathing. Marcello couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him to simply sit and color, to engage in activity with no strategic purpose or financial implication. His days were filled with meetings that determined territories and deals that moved millions, decisions that affected hundreds of people who'd never know his name. But here was a 6-year-old offering him a green crayon and a space to color Stegosaurus plates, and somehow that felt more important than anything waiting in his actual life. He accepted the crayon, the waxy stick feeling foreign in fingers accustomed to signing contracts and holding weapons disguised as business tools. Kit scooted closer on the bench, positioning the coloring book between them so both could reach, his small shoulder pressing against Marcello's arm. The boy began coloring a pterodactyl with focused concentration, tongue poking slightly between his lips, completely absorbed in the task of choosing between burnt orange and regular orange for prehistoric wings. Marcello found himself coloring within the lines of a Stegosaurus plate, the repetitive motions strangely meditative, a rhythm that required no decisions beyond which shade of green looked most authentic. Kit provided commentary on proper dinosaur coloring techniques, explaining with absolute certainty that velociraptors were never purple despite what the crayon box suggested. His expertise came from a library book Miss Linley had checked out 3 weeks ago, information delivered with the gravity of someone citing peer-reviewed research. The terminal's overhead lights flickered once, then steadied, a reminder that the storm outside was affecting more than just travel schedules. Other stranded passengers had begun eyeing the wooden benches with territorial interest, calculating which spots would be least uncomfortable for an unplanned overnight stay. A family of 4 settled 2 benches away, the father already on his phone trying to explain to someone why they wouldn't make dinner, his apologetic tone suggesting this wasn't the first holiday plan his job had disrupted. Kit finished his pterodactyl and moved on to a T-Rex, selecting a green so dark it was almost black, explaining that predators needed serious colors. Miss Linley says I have very strong opinions about things, he announced, not sounding remotely apologetic about this character trait. His casual mention of this Miss Linley in every third sentence painted a picture of someone central to his universe, a gravitational force around which his small life orbited. She sounds important to you, Marcello observed, keeping his voice neutral even as his mind catalogued the concerning pattern. A child left alone for hours, talking about one person with reverence usually reserved for parents. Kit nodded enthusiastically, his whole body participating in the gesture, curls bouncing under the goro that had slipped even more crooked. She's my caseworker, he said, with the matter-of-fact tone children use for information adults usually whisper. That means she finds places for kids like me to stay. The casual revelation hit Marcello harder than he expected, confirmation of suspicions that made the 3-hour wait even more troubling. Kit continued coloring, unbothered by the weight of what he'd just shared, accustomed to his own reality and the way children adapt to circumstances they didn't choose. I've had 4 caseworkers before, but Miss Linley is the best one, Kit continued, adding teeth to his T-Rex with careful precision. The others always looked tired and sad, but Miss Linley smiles real smiles, not the pretend kind. Marcello understood the distinction better than most, had spent decades perfecting pretend smiles that never reached his eyes, professional expressions that communicated warmth without actually feeling it. The fact that a 6-year-old had already learned to differentiate authentic emotion from performance-suggested experiences that aged children faster than they should age. He selected a brown crayon and began working on a triceratops, finding unexpected comfort in the simple task of filling predetermined spaces with color. Where are you supposed to go after Miss Linley picks you up? The question came out more abruptly than intended, Marcello's usual directness overriding the gentle approach he'd been attempting. Kit didn't seem bothered by the bluntness, just paused his coloring to consider the answer, like he was deciding which crayon to use next. His small face scrunched in thought, trying to remember details that clearly hadn't seemed important enough to stick. A new place, Kit said finally, his vagueness suggesting either he hadn't been told specifics or hadn't retained them. Miss Linley said they have an extra bedroom and a dog named Copper who's very gentle with kids. The information was delivered with cautious optimism, hope tempered by experience that had taught him not to get too excited about promises involving dogs and bedrooms. He'd clearly learned that temporary was the only permanent feature of his existence. The coloring book page was filling up with their combined efforts. Dinosaurs taking on life through waxy pigments, applied by mismatched hands, one belonging to a 6-year-old in the foster system, the other to a man who ran an empire most people pretended didn't exist. Marcello noticed Kit favoring his right hand, the left occasionally rubbing his stomach through the puffy blue coat in a gesture that might have been hunger or nervous habit. The dinosaur crackers had been generous sharing, but probably represented the boy's entire food supply. "When did you eat last?" Marcello asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. Kit's hand stilled on the T-Rex he'd been detailing, his expression suggesting this was a question he'd been hoping to avoid. "Breakfast," he admitted quietly, and Marcello's internal clock calculated that breakfast had been at least 10 hours ago, possibly longer depending on Kit's definition of morning. The lukewarm hot chocolate and handful of crackers weren't sustenance, they were theater, props in a performance of being fine. Marcello stood abruptly, the movement startling Kit, who looked up with those round eyes that had somehow become familiar in less than an hour. "Stay here with Mr. Buttons," Marcello instructed, his tone carrying the authority that made grown men obey without question. "Don't move from this bench. I'll be back in 5 minutes." He needed Kit to understand this wasn't abandonment, that 5 minutes meant 5 minutes, that some people actually returned when they said they would. Kit nodded, clutching the teddy bear a bit tighter, and Marcello recognized the small fear flickering across the boy's face, the worry that this stranger who'd shared his bench might join the long list of people who walked away. 5 minutes, Marcello repeated, tapping his expensive watch. "Time it if you want." The suggestion seemed to help, giving Kit something concrete to focus on, a way to measure the promise against reality. Marcello navigated through the terminal's chaos with the efficiency of someone used to moving through crowds that instinctively parted for men in expensive suits. The food court was still partially operational despite the storm, a few vendors keeping their stands open for the captive audience of stranded travelers. He ordered enough food for 3 people: sandwiches, fruit cups, chips, cookies, hot soup in containers that would stay warm, ignoring the cashier's curious look at the quantity. The transaction took 4 minutes and 30 seconds, and when Marcello returned to the bench, Kit's face transformed with relief so profound, it was almost painful to witness. The boy had been counting on his fingers, tracking time the way someone tracks ammunition in a firefight, rationing hope against the possibility of disappointment. "You came back," Kit said, and the surprise in his voice, despite Marcello's promise, suggested that adults returning when they said they would was the exception, rather than the rule in his experience. "I said I would," Marcello replied simply, settling back onto the bench and distributing the food with the same precision he applied to business negotiations. Kit's eyes widened at the spread, looking at the sandwiches and soup like they represented treasure rather than terminal food court offerings. "This is for me?" he asked, seeking confirmation before touching anything, demonstrating the caution of someone who'd learned not to assume generosity. "All of it," Marcello confirmed, opening the soup container and handing Kit the spoon. The boy ate with the focused intensity of genuine hunger, barely contained by manners someone had taught him mattered. He didn't shove food in his mouth or grab multiple items at once, but the speed of his consumption and the way he watched the remaining food suggested scarcity was more familiar than abundance. "Mr. Buttons got positioned to watch the meal, propped against the backpack like a guardian of temporary plenty. Between bites of sandwich, turkey and cheese that Kit consumed in systematic sections, the boy asked questions that revealed curiosity about Marcello's life without understanding why those questions might be dangerous. "What do you do for work?" Kit asked, the kind of innocent inquiry that in other contexts would trigger careful non-answers and strategic deflections. Marcello found himself saying business, which was technically true, though it omitted the kind of business that made prosecutors dream about RICO charges. "What kind of business?" Kit pressed, unbothered by vague answers, persistent in the way children are when they want real information. Marcello considered how to explain an empire built on fear and favors, territory disputes settled with violence disguised as accidents, money that moved through channels designed to confuse anyone trying to track it. "The complicated kind," he finally said, which made Kit nod thoughtfully as if this actually explained something rather than nothing. The boy seemed satisfied with the non-answer, moving on to fruit cups that he ate with careful attention to not spilling juice on Mr. Buttons. "I want to work with animals when I grow up," Kit announced, sharing his own aspirations with the openness of someone who hadn't learned that dreams could be used as weapons. Miss Linley says wanting to help things is a good quality. The reverence returned to his voice when mentioning her, that gravitational pull toward the one stable figure in his constellation. Marcello watched Kit eat, remembering his own childhood hunger that went beyond physical need, the gnawing emptiness of being no one's priority in a system designed to process rather than nurture. He'd clawed his way out of foster care through methods he couldn't share with this innocent child, had built power from powerlessness through choices that destroyed the boy he'd been. Kit still had softness around his edges, hadn't been sharpened into a weapon yet, and something in Marcello wanted to keep it that way, even though he knew better than to get attached. The terminal continued its slow transformation from transit hub to emergency shelter, employees distributing thin blankets to families settling in for the duration. Christmas music had been replaced by more practical announcements about restroom locations and charging station availability. Kit finished his soup and carefully stacked the empty containers, demonstrating the tidiness of someone who'd learned that making messes meant losing privileges. "Thank you for the food," he said formally, channeling whatever etiquette training he'd received. "That was the best dinner I've had in probably forever." The hyperbole was pure child, but the gratitude was genuine, and Marcello felt something twist in his chest that might have been conscience reawakening after years of deliberate dormancy. His phone buzzed with messages he ignored, associates wondering where he'd disappeared to, business that would keep running without his immediate attention, a world that suddenly seemed less important than this bench and this boy. Kit had started a new coloring page, this one featuring marine dinosaurs, and he offered Marcello the blue crayon without looking up. They colored in companionable silence while snow continued its assault on the city outside, the storm showing no signs of weakening despite meteorologists' earlier predictions. Other passengers shot occasional glances at the unlikely pair, the man in the expensive suit and the boy with the dinosaur backpack, trying to determine their relationship and apparently settling on father and son, despite the lack of resemblance. Marcello noticed these assumptions but didn't correct them, found he didn't mind being mistaken for someone who belonged to this child. Kit's coloring grew slower, his movements less precise as exhaustion caught up with him despite the food-provided energy boost. He tried to stifle a yawn but failed, the gesture so enormous it seemed to engage his entire small body. "I'm not sleepy, though," he insisted with the transparent lie of children fighting bedtime, even as his eyes drooped and his grip on the crayon loosened. Mr. Buttons had already been pulled close, the teddy bear resuming its role as comfort object rather than dining companion. "You can rest if you want," Marcello found himself saying, his voice gentler than it had been in years, softness he'd thought he'd trained out of himself completely. "I'll stay here." The promise seemed important to articulate, to make clear that sleep wouldn't mean waking up alone, that this bench had become temporary sanctuary rather than another place of abandonment. Kit considered this offer with the seriousness of someone weighing crucial decisions, then nodded and shifted position. The boy curled against Marcello's side with the easy trust of exhaustion overriding caution, his head finding a spot against Marcello's ribs that somehow fit, despite the awkwardness of the angle. Mr. Buttons got wedged between them, the teddy bear's worn fur pressed against expensive wool, and Kit's breathing began to slow and deepen. 5 minutes, he mumbled, fighting sleep even as it claimed him. "You said 5 minutes." His voice trailed off as consciousness released its grip, leaving him vulnerable in the way only sleeping children manage. Marcello sat motionless as Kit slept, hyper-aware of the small weight pressed against him, the trust implicit in this unconscious surrender. The terminal's sound seemed to soften around them, or maybe he was just filtering differently, focusing on the child's steady breathing instead of ambient chaos. His arm had gone slightly numb from staying in one position, but moving would risk waking Kit, so he stayed frozen like a statue built around this sleeping boy. An hour passed, measured by the terminal's famous clock, then another, the night deepening toward that dead zone between late and early when even New York's energy dims. Marcello's phone continued its periodic buzzing, messages he read one-handed without responding, maintaining his vigil while his empire operated on autopilot. Nothing in those messages was urgent enough to disturb this strange peace he'd found on a wooden bench during a snowstorm with someone else's forgotten child. That's when he saw her, a woman pushing through the terminal's entrance in a blast of snow and cold air, her blonde hair escaping from a ponytail, her wool coat dusted white. She moved with the frantic purpose of someone who'd been delayed against their will, her eyes scanning the crowd with desperate intensity. Even from a distance, Marcello recognized the particular panic of someone looking for a lost child, that primal fear that transcends professional boundaries. Her gaze locked onto their bench, and relief flooded her features so completely that for a moment she just stood there, one hand pressed to her chest. Then she was moving again, navigating between stranded travelers with apologies that tumbled out automatically, her focus never leaving Kit's sleeping form. Marcello watched her approach, noting details with the automatic assessment he applied to everyone. Mid-30s, probably, tired in the bone-deep way that suggested she carried too much weight for too long. But her eyes held warmth that hadn't been extinguished by whatever burdens she shouldered. "Kit," she breathed when she reached them, dropping to her knees beside the bench despite the dirty floor, her voice catching on the single syllable. Then her eyes shifted to Marcello, really seeing him for the first time, and her expression cycled through confusion, gratitude, and wariness. "I'm Linley," she said, her voice steadier now, professional training reasserting itself over maternal panic. "I'm Kit's caseworker. I was stuck at the office when the storm got bad, and then the train stopped, and I've been trying to get here for hours." The explanation poured out with the need to justify that Marcello recognized from people who knew they'd failed, but wanted mitigating circumstances considered. "He's been waiting since 3, Marcello said, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Kit, stating fact without judgment, though the situation spoke for itself. Linley's face crumpled slightly before she caught herself, professional mask sliding back into place, but not before Marcello saw the genuine distress at having left this child alone for so long. I know. I called the station, but they said all trains were stopped and I couldn't get through on my cell and..." She stopped herself, seeming to realize that excuses wouldn't change the reality of a 6-year-old waiting alone in a terminal for hours. Instead, she looked at Kit, still peacefully asleep against Marcello's side, then back at Marcello with questions forming behind her eyes. "Thank you for staying with him," she said simply, the words carrying weight that suggested she understood exactly what could have happened to an unattended child. "He asked if anyone came with me," Marcello replied, offering explanation for why a stranger in an expensive suit had spent his evening coloring dinosaurs instead of disappearing onto the next train. "Seemed like we were both alone, so we waited together." He didn't mention the food, the shared crackers, the way Kit's trust had worked its way past defenses Marcello had thought were impenetrable. Those details felt private somehow, moments belonging to the strange intimacy they'd built in this suspended time. Linley's eyes softened further, seeing past the suit and the controlled expression to something underneath that Marcello usually kept buried. "He does that," she said, her voice carrying affection mixed with concern. "Adopts people. Asks the dangerous questions that make you look at yourself differently." She reached out tentatively and brushed curls off Kit's forehead, with the gentleness of someone who genuinely cared, not just performed professional duty. "I should wake him. We need to try to find somewhere to stay until morning. The hotels are full," Marcello said, having overheard enough desperate phone conversations from other stranded travelers to know the situation. "Most places stopped taking guests hours ago, and the ones that haven't are charging emergency rates." Linley's face tightened at this information, her jaw setting in the expression of someone calculating limited resources against impossible circumstances. Kit stirred slightly at the sound of voices, his small hand gripping Marcello's coat before settling back into sleep. "There's a VIP lounge on the upper level," Marcello heard himself say, the words emerging before he'd consciously decided to offer. "Private, quiet, lockable doors. They'll let me in." The unspoken truth hung between them. Places opened for Marcello Cray that remained closed to ordinary people. Doors unlocked by reputation and money, and the kind of influence that didn't require explanation. Linley's expression shifted through multiple calculations, weighing the inappropriateness of accepting help from a stranger against the reality of spending the night on a terminal bench with a 6-year-old. "I don't even know your name," she said finally, the objection weak because they both knew she was going to accept. Her professional training probably screamed warnings about strangers offering private spaces, but maternal instinct, or whatever drove her investment in Kit, was clearly winning the internal debate. "Marcello," he supplied, omitting the last name that would have changed this conversation entirely, that would have sent her running despite the storm and the impossible alternatives. "And you need somewhere safe for him to sleep that isn't marble floor in public view." Linley looked at Kit again, his small body curled trustingly against this stranger, and something in her face suggested she was recognizing the same thing Marcello had seen, that the boy possessed dangerous levels of faith in people who didn't deserve it. "Okay," she said quietly, the word carrying surrender to necessity rather than enthusiasm. But just until morning. Just until the trains start running again. The caveats were for herself more than him. Boundaries drawn to maintain some illusion of control in a situation that had spiraled beyond her management hours ago. Marcello shifted carefully, preparing to wake Kit without startling him, but the boy's eyes opened on their own, as if some internal alarm had registered the change in adult energy. He blinked slowly, confused about where he was before memory returned, and his face split into a smile that transformed his features. "Miss Linley." The joy in his voice was pure and uncomplicated, the reunion of someone whose faith had been validated rather than someone who should have been angry about being abandoned. He launched himself at her with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of a just-woken child. Linley caught him and held on perhaps longer than professionally appropriate, her face buried in his curls, her shoulders shaking slightly in a way that suggested tears she was fighting. "I'm so sorry, buddy," she whispered against his goro, the apology thick with guilt that clearly went beyond this single incident. "The train stopped, and I couldn't get here, and I was so worried." Kit patted her back with small hands, comforting the adult who should have been comforting him. Role reversal that spoke volumes about his experience with disappointed grown-ups. "It's okay," Kit assured her with the easy forgiveness of children who haven't learned to hold grudges yet. "Marcello stayed with me and we colored dinosaurs and he bought me dinner and I wasn't scared at all." The summary of their evening reduced hours to simple activities, omitting the emotional weight that had made those hours significant. Linley pulled back to look at Kit's face, checking for signs of distress or harm, her caseworker training taking inventory of his physical and emotional state. She found him unchanged, except for chocolate stains on his sleeves, and what appeared to be genuine contentment in his expression, both anomalies that made her glance at Marcello with renewed curiosity. "He's been very brave," Marcello said, collecting the coloring book and crayons that Kit had left scattered on the bench. "Though I think we could all use somewhere more comfortable to wait out this storm." The suggestion was gentle but pointed, redirecting the conversation toward practical solutions, rather than dwelling on failures neither of them could undo. Kit's eyes lit up at the mention of going somewhere, his natural enthusiasm reasserting itself, now that Miss Linley had materialized as promised. "Where are we going?" he asked, looking between the two adults like they'd suddenly become a unit making decisions together. Mr. Buttons got retrieved from where he'd been pressed against Marcello's coat, the teddy bear inspected to ensure he'd survived the nap undamaged. Linley stood, keeping one hand on Kit's shoulder as if worried he might disappear if she stopped touching him. "Marcello's offered us access to a VIP lounge," Linley explained, her tone suggesting she was still processing the strangeness of this entire situation. "Somewhere warm and quiet where you can sleep properly." Kit absorbed this information and immediately grabbed Marcello's hand with his free one, creating a chain of 3 people connected by circumstance and storm. The gesture was so natural, so assuming of continued connection, that neither adult immediately pulled away, despite the awkwardness of this forced intimacy. They moved through the terminal as an unlikely trio, Kit between them chattering about the dinosaurs he'd colored and the food Marcello had bought, his voice echoing in the vast space that had grown quieter as night deepened. Other stranded passengers watched them pass with the idle curiosity of people with nothing else to do, probably inventing stories about who they were and why they moved together with such purpose. Marcello led them toward elevators that most travelers didn't know existed, access points for terminal staff and people with the right credentials. The elevator required a key card that Marcello produced without explanation, sliding it through the reader with practiced ease that suggested this wasn't his first time accessing restricted areas. Linley noticed, but didn't comment, her mind clearly running through all the reasons a man in a suit might have VIP access to Grand Central Terminal. The doors closed on the 3 of them, the small space forcing proximity that made Kit giggle because he was squished between adult bodies in a way that felt like a game rather than constraint. The VIP lounge occupied the terminal's upper level, a space most travelers never saw, designed for people who paid premium prices to avoid the masses below. Marcello's card opened this door too, revealing a room that was elegant without being ostentatious. Leather furniture, soft lighting, floor-to-ceiling windows that showed the storm from a different angle. It was empty this late, staff having abandoned their posts when it became clear no regular VIP passengers would be arriving during the storm. Kit explored immediately, his exhaustion forgotten in the excitement of new territory, touching furniture with careful fingers like he was visiting a museum. "Can I really sit on this?" he asked, gesturing toward a leather couch that probably cost more than Linley made in a month. You can sit, lie down, whatever you need, Marcello confirmed, watching the boy test the furniture with systematic thoroughness. Mr. Buttons got positioned on a chair in a spot where he could see the whole room, sentinel duty assigned with solemn importance. Linley stood near the door looking simultaneously grateful and uncomfortable, a woman accepting help she couldn't refuse but didn't quite trust. "This is too much," she started, the protest automatic even though she made no move to leave. "We can't impose on your space like this." Marcello noticed she'd said your space rather than a space, recognizing that his access implied ownership, or at least authority, that went beyond normal passenger privileges. "You're not imposing," Marcello said simply, moving toward a small kitchenette area that held a coffee maker and refrigerator stocked with beverages most people couldn't pronounce. "I wasn't planning to use it anyway." This was true. He'd been planning to board a train to nowhere, had been fleeing rather than arriving anywhere specific. The lounge had been backup option number 3, place to wait if weather prevented all departures, contingency he'd accessed more than once when business required overnight terminal presence. Kit had discovered the windows and pressed his face against the glass, watching snow spiral past the lit building facades across the street. "It's like we're in a snow globe," he announced, echoing his earlier observation but with more wonder now that they were higher up. Perspective changed. "Like we're the tiny people inside and someone's shaking our world." The poetry of his observation caught both adults off guard, this child finding magic in the storm that had disrupted thousands of carefully made plans. Linley finally moved deeper into the room, accepting the reality of where they were, her professional boundaries dissolving under the weight of practical necessity. She slipped off her wool coat, revealing clothes that had seen better days, and a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Thank you," she said to Marcello, the words inadequate but sincere. "I know this is strange and you don't owe us anything, but thank you for not leaving him alone down there." Her voice caught slightly on the last words, imagination filling in all the terrible alternatives. "He asked a good question," Marcello replied, deflecting gratitude he didn't feel he'd earned for doing the bare minimum of human decency. "Made me realize we were both waiting alone, so we waited together." Kit had left the window and was now investigating a basket of wrapped snacks on a side table, holding each one up for Linley's approval before adding it to a growing pile. His enthusiasm for food that hadn't needed to be rationed was almost heartbreaking in its intensity. The lounge settled into strange domesticity as the three of them occupied space together, negotiating invisible boundaries and unexpected comfort. Kit claimed the longest couch after Linley's permission. Arranging himself and Mr. Buttons with pillows and a blanket Marcello retrieved from a storage closet. The boy fought sleep with valiant determination, wanting to participate in whatever the adults were doing, even though his eyes kept drifting closed. "Tell me when something interesting happens," he mumbled, already half gone despite his protests. Linley and Marcello gravitated toward chairs positioned near the windows, but angled to keep Kit in peripheral vision, the unspoken agreement of two people who'd appointed themselves guardians for the night. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with questions neither quite knew how to ask. Outside, the storm continued its assault, snow piling on window ledges in drifts that would take days to melt. The city's usual lights had dimmed, buildings conserving power, or simply shut down until weather improved. "I've been his caseworker for 8 months, Linley said finally, her voice quiet but carrying in the insulated space. "4th placement in 2 years, and each one falls apart for different reasons." She wasn't looking at Marcello when she spoke, her gaze fixed on Kit's sleeping form like she was confessing to him rather than explaining to a stranger. "He's a good kid, you've seen that, but the system isn't designed for good kids. It's designed for processing, for moving problems from one temporary solution to another." The bitterness in her tone suggested this wasn't abstract criticism, but personal failure she carried, the weight of every child she couldn't save permanently. Marcello recognized that particular flavor of guilt, the knowledge that you're operating within a broken system while lacking power to fix the fundamental fractures. "Why social work?" he asked, genuine curiosity overriding his usual policy of not engaging with other people's motivations. "If you know the system's broken, why stay in it?" "Because someone has to care," Linley replied simply, finally looking at him directly with eyes that held conviction and exhaustion in equal measure. "And most people burn out or stop seeing the kids as actual humans after a few years. They become cases, files, problems to solve on paper." She paused, seeming to weigh how much to share with this stranger who'd somehow become audience to her crisis. Kit deserves someone who remembers he's 6, not just a case number waiting for permanent placement. Marcello absorbed this, turning the information over in his mind alongside memories of his own childhood in similar systems, caseworkers who'd ranged from actively harmful to benignly indifferent. I was in foster care, he heard himself admit, the confession emerging from some unlocked place he usually kept sealed. Ages 7 to 16, 5 different homes, more caseworkers than I remember. Linley's expression shifted, understanding clicking into place about why he'd stayed with Kit, why he'd recognized something familiar in the boy's practiced optimism. That's why you didn't leave him, she said, not quite a question but seeking confirmation anyway. You knew what it felt like to wait for someone who might not come. Marcello nodded once, sharp acknowledgement that didn't require elaboration, because they both understood the specifics didn't matter. The core experience was universal among forgotten children, that particular flavor of abandonment that taught you early to expect disappointment while still hoping desperately for the exception. He has your mannerisms, Linley observed, her professional training identifying patterns Marcello hadn't consciously noticed. The way he watches before trusting, how he offers food like currency, that thing where he makes himself smaller in new spaces. She was right. Kit had demonstrated all of these survival strategies, adaptations that children in unstable situations developed like calluses over repeated wounds. It's heartbreaking that 6-year-olds need those skills, she added, anger seeping through her exhaustion. But necessary, Marcello countered, his tone pragmatic where hers was emotional. Because not all strangers are safe, and not all promises get kept, and he needs to recognize danger before it recognizes him. The darkness in his response made Linley study him more carefully, reassessing who she was sitting with in this borrowed space. Marcello could see her mind working, trying to reconcile the man who'd colored dinosaurs with the one who spoke about danger with intimate familiarity. What do you actually do, Marcello? The question carried weight, professional concern overriding the gratitude that had made her accept his help. Because men with VIP access to Grand Central and suits that expensive usually have reasons they prefer not to explain. She'd noticed more than he'd given her credit for, had been cataloging details while managing her crisis about Kit. Smart, observant, not easily fooled, all qualities that probably made her good at her job and dangerous to people with secrets. Business, Marcello repeated his earlier non-answer, but Linley's expression made clear that wouldn't satisfy her this time. Import, export, logistics, things that require odd hours and private spaces. Every word was technically true while revealing nothing of substance, the art of answering without informing that he'd perfected over decades. Linley didn't push further, but her silence communicated skepticism, the awareness that she was accepting help from someone whose legitimacy remained unconfirmed. I'm not a danger to him, Marcello said, addressing the unspoken concern directly because pretending it didn't exist felt dishonest. Whatever else I might be, I wouldn't hurt a child. The vehemence in his voice surprised even him, revealing convictions he didn't usually articulate because his world operated on assumptions rather than declared principles. Linley held his gaze for a long moment, some internal assessment taking place behind her eyes before she nodded slowly. I believe you, she said finally, and Marcello wasn't sure if that made her wise or naive, or just desperate enough to trust her instincts over protocol. But Kit gets attached easily, and I have to place him with a family tomorrow, and he doesn't need more people disappearing from his life. The warning was gentle but clear. Don't become important if you're not staying. Don't make promises your life can't keep. Don't break this child who's been broken enough already. Understood, Marcello agreed, even as something in his chest protested the limitation. Resisted the idea of walking away when morning came and never thinking about dinosaur backpacks and worn teddy bears again. His phone buzzed again, the 4th message in an hour from his second-in-command, and this time he pulled it out to read the growing concern about his absence. The business was fine, the empire wasn't crumbling, but his unexplained disappearance during a major storm had triggered security protocols and worried speculation. He typed a quick response, delayed by storm, will update morning, and silenced the phone completely, a level of disconnection that would have been unthinkable 6 hours ago. Linley watched this small rebellion with interest, seeing perhaps more than he intended, in the gesture of a man choosing to stay present, rather than remaining tethered to obligations elsewhere. Does anyone know where you are? She asked, the caseworker in her automatically checking for safety protocols even when she was the one accepting mysterious help. They know I'm somewhere in the terminal, Marcello said, gesturing vaguely at the world beyond their bubble. But I'd prefer to keep this private. Or, he wasn't sure how to explain that his reputation couldn't accommodate being seen coloring with abandoned children. That power in his world required maintaining certain images that had no room for softness. Linley seemed to understand without full explanation, nodding her acceptance of this boundary while filing away the information for future assessment. Kit stirred on the couch, mumbling something about pterodactyls before settling back into deeper sleep, his small chest rising and falling with the perfect rhythm of childhood unconsciousness. Both adults watched him for a moment, unified in whatever protective instinct he'd triggered in them. "What happens tomorrow?" Marcello asked, dreading the answer, but needing to know how this story ended for the boy who'd asked if anyone had come with him. "The family that's taking him lives in Queens, so once the trains run I'll get him there and do the initial placement check," Linley explained, her tone shifting into professional mode as she outlined logistics. "They seem nice enough, passed all the screenings, have fostered before. It should be good." The caveat in that final sentence, "should be," carried all the uncertainty of good intentions meeting unpredictable reality, the knowledge that paperwork couldn't guarantee kindness or permanence. Morning arrived gradually, the storm's fury finally exhausting itself as dawn painted the sky in shades that looked bruised and tender. Marcello had dozed fitfully in his chair, never quite achieving actual sleep, his body trained to remain alert even in supposedly safe spaces. Linley had fared similarly across from him, her eyes opening every time Kit shifted, maternal vigilance overriding her own exhaustion. The boy himself had slept soundly, the deep rest of someone whose body had finally felt safe enough to surrender completely. Kit woke to find them both watching him with expressions that made him pause, some child instinct recognizing that the adults wore the faces people made before goodbyes. "Is it time to go?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep, clutching Mr. Buttons close like the teddy bear might anchor him against whatever came next. Linley smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes, that performance of cheerfulness adults attempted when delivering news that would hurt. "The trains are running again," she confirmed, checking her phone for schedules that had finally updated overnight. The VIP lounge had become a cocoon separate from the real world, but now reality pressed against their bubble with insistent weight. Kit climbed off the couch and began repacking his dinosaur backpack with systematic care, returning borrowed crayons to their Ziploc bag, folding the blanket he'd used despite Linley's assurance that staff would handle it. He was preparing for departure, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd packed and unpacked too many times, transitions that marked his life in befores and afters. Marcello stood and stretched muscles that protested the night spent in a chair, his expensive suit rumpled in ways that would scandalize his usual associates. He should leave now, should extract himself before this became more complicated than it already was, return to the empire that required his attention. But something kept him rooted, watching Kit prepare for yet another displacement, and he found himself saying, "I'll walk down with you," before consciously deciding to make the offer. Linley looked like she might object, then reconsidered, perhaps recognizing that Kit would need all the support available for this transition. They gathered their few belongings. The coloring book Kit insisted was Marcello's now because we did it together. The snacks that hadn't been eaten, Mr. Buttons secured safely in Kit's arms. The elevator ride down felt heavy with unspoken things. Kit pressed between them again, but this time the silence wasn't comfortable, just sad with the weight of endings neither wanted to name. Grand Central Terminal had transformed overnight from chaotic shelter back toward normal operations, cleaning crews working to clear debris and disorder left by thousands of stranded travelers. Departure boards showed mostly green instead of red, trains resuming their schedules with only minor delays remaining. The storm had passed, the city was recovering, and life was returning to its usual patterns as if the previous night's suspension had never occurred. They found a bench, not the original one but close enough, and sat together while Linley pulled up train information and made phone calls about timing and logistics. Kit leaned against Marcello's side like this was natural, like they'd known each other longer than one storm-stranded night. His small warmth a reminder of everything Marcello usually kept walled away. "Are you taking the train too?" Kit asked, looking up with those round eyes that somehow still held hope, despite everything that taught him hope was dangerous. "Different train," Marcello said, the lie easier than explaining he had no train to catch, no destination waiting, just the same empty movement he'd been attempting before this interruption, but maybe the same direction for a while. Kit seemed satisfied with this vague answer, content with the illusion of continued proximity even if temporary. Linley finished her calls and stood, extending her hand to Kit with gentle finality that indicated departure couldn't be delayed any longer. "Come on, buddy. We need to catch the Queen's train." Her voice carried forced brightness, the professional mask back in place but cracking around the edges. Kit stood, but didn't take her hand immediately, turning instead to face Marcello with an expression that was trying very hard to be brave. "Thank you for waiting with me," he said formally, that same handshake etiquette from yesterday reappearing. "And for the food and the coloring and not leaving when you said you wouldn't." The gratitude for basic human decency broke something in Marcello that he'd kept carefully contained, made him hate every adult who'd taught this child that kept promises deserved special thanks. "You're welcome," he managed, shaking Kit's small hand again, feeling the warmth and trust that he absolutely didn't deserve. "Take care of Mr. Buttons." Kit nodded solemnly, then did something unexpected. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Marcello's waist in a hug that was brief but complete. Marcello's arms moved automatically to return the embrace before his brain caught up to instruct him otherwise, his hands settling on small shoulders covered in puffy blue coat. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds but felt longer, compressed time that held weight beyond its duration. Then Kit released him and stepped back, rejoining Linley, who was watching this goodbye with an expression Marcello couldn't quite read. Sad recognition, maybe, or concern about attachments forming too quickly. "We should go," Linley said gently, her hand finally finding Kit's shoulder to guide him toward the platforms. Kit waved at Marcello, a small gesture that somehow demanded acknowledgement, so Marcello raised his hand in return. They walked away through the morning crowd, the woman in the worn coat and the boy with the dinosaur backpack, becoming smaller with distance until they turned a corner and disappeared from view. Just like that, as if they'd never intersected with Marcello's carefully controlled life. He stood there longer than made sense, staring at the space where they'd vanished, his chest tight with something he refused to name, because naming it would require acknowledging that one night had affected him more than it should. Around him, the terminal continued its indifferent operations, thousands of people beginning their days, catching trains, having destinations. Marcello had none of these things, just the hollow realization that he was alone again, but it felt different now, worse somehow, like he'd been reminded of something he'd learned to live without. His phone buzzed insistently, the real world demanding his return, business that wouldn't manage itself forever. Marcello pulled it out and saw 12 missed calls, 23 messages, all variations of "where are you?" and "when are you coming back?" He could board any train right now, disappear into the anonymity of travel, or return to the empire that would continue running with or without his immediate presence. Both options felt equally meaningless. Motion without purpose, existence without the peculiar warmth a 6-year-old's company had provided. He thought about Kit, arriving at yet another temporary home, being introduced to new rooms and new rules, and a dog named Copper who might or might not live up to promises. Thought about how the boy would unpack his dinosaur backpack and position Mr. Buttons somewhere strategic, and try to make himself small in this new space until he figured out what behavior kept him safe. The images made Marcello's hands curl into fists, useless anger at systems he had no power to change, despite all the power he'd accumulated in his particular world. Marcello turned toward the exit, preparing to rejoin the life he'd temporarily abandoned, when he saw Linley rushing back through the crowd alone, her expression urgent. His heart stopped. Something had happened to Kit. But then he registered that her urgency was different, not panic, but purpose. She reached him breathless, having clearly run the distance back. "The family," she said without preamble, words tumbling out. "They just called. Their apartment flooded overnight from burst pipes. They can't take Kit today, maybe not this week." The news should have been disappointing, another bureaucratic complication in an already complicated situation. Instead, Marcello felt something like relief, like the universe had granted unexpected reprieve from a goodbye that had felt premature and wrong. "Where is he?" Marcello asked, already moving before Linley answered, following her back through the terminal toward where she'd left Kit waiting on a platform bench. The boy sat exactly where he'd been positioned, patient as always, Mr. Buttons on his lap, looking small and alone despite the crowd surrounding him. When Kit saw them returning together, his face transformed with confused hope, not quite understanding why they'd come back but clearly glad they had. "Change of plans," Linley said, kneeling in front of him with the kind of honesty she probably used to counteract all the lies other adults had told him. "The place where you were going isn't ready yet, so we need to find somewhere else for you to stay, just for a little while." Kit processed this with the weary acceptance of someone used to plans changing, nodding slowly, even as Marcello could see the hope draining from his eyes like water from a cracked cup. How long is a little while? Kit asked, the question revealing his experience that temporary could mean anything from hours to months, time measured unreliably by adults who controlled his world. Lindley opened her mouth to answer, but had nothing concrete to offer, just more uncertainty and maybes. Marcello watched this exchange, watched the boy's shoulders slump slightly under the weight of continued displacement, and heard himself speak before rational thought could intervene. He can stay with me. The 3 words hung in the air between them, impossible and reckless, the kind of offer that violated every boundary Marcello had spent decades constructing. Lindley's head snapped toward him, her expression cycling through shock, confusion, and professional alarm in rapid succession. Kit looked between them with growing hope that was almost painful to witness, his small hands clutching Mr. Buttons tighter as if the teddy bear might confirm whether he'd heard correctly. The terminal continued its morning rush around them, oblivious to this moment that was rearranging 3 lives in ways none of them had anticipated 12 hours ago. You can't be serious, Lindley said finally, her voice low and urgent, the tone of someone trying to prevent a catastrophic mistake. You don't just offer to take a child home. There are protocols, background checks, certifications required. You can't just... She trailed off, looking at Kit, who was watching Marcello with those round eyes that held dangerous amounts of faith in adults who made promises. Her professional training was screaming warnings about strangers and inappropriate arrangements, but underneath that, Marcello could see her desperation for solutions that didn't exist. I'm serious, Marcello said, his voice carrying the same certainty he used when making business decisions that affected millions. Temporary placement, emergency foster situation, whatever paperwork makes it legitimate. He looked directly at Lindley, willing her to see past the surface strangeness to the practical reality underneath. You said yourself the hotels are still overbooked from the storm. Your office is probably overwhelmed with similar situations, and he needs somewhere safe to stay that isn't another institutional holding pattern. Each point was delivered with the precision of someone who understood how to build arguments that bypassed emotional objections. Lindley opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again, her mind clearly working through scenarios and coming up empty on better alternatives. This is insane, she muttered, more to herself than to them, running both hands through her blonde hair in a gesture of someone whose day had spiraled beyond all recognition. I could lose my license for placing a child with someone who hasn't been vetted, whose background I don't even know, who I met 12 hours ago during a snowstorm. But even as she listed the objections, Marcello could hear her resolve weakening under the weight of impossible circumstances. Then vet me, Marcello countered, pulling his wallet and extracting several forms of identification that carried his real name, his business addresses, information that would reveal exactly who he was once she started investigating. Run whatever checks you need to run. I have a home that's secure, resources to provide what he needs, and I'm not going anywhere. He was offering her ammunition to potentially destroy him, giving her access to information he usually kept carefully compartmentalized, but Kit's continued homelessness felt more important than protecting his usual paranoia about privacy. Kit had gone very still during this exchange, his eyes tracking between the adults like he was watching a tennis match that would determine his immediate future. I'd be good, he offered quietly, his voice small, but determined. I know how to be quiet, and I don't need much space, and I promise I wouldn't touch anything important. The litany of promises revealed every temporary home that had made him feel like an imposition, every placement that had taught him to make himself smaller and less troublesome to accommodate adults' convenience. Marcello felt something crack further at Kit's desperate assurances, the boy already negotiating the terms of his own acceptance before anyone had agreed to anything. You don't have to be anything except yourself, Marcello said, kneeling so they were eye level, abandoning the strategic high ground to meet Kit in his space. If this happens, you get to be 6 years old and loud and messy and take up whatever space you need. The boy's eyes went wide, like he was hearing a foreign language that promised impossible freedoms. Lindley watched this interaction with an expression that suggested she was witnessing something significant, but couldn't quite categorize it properly. I need to make calls, she said finally, her tone resigned to exploring options her training said shouldn't exist. Real calls to my supervisor, to legal, to people who can tell me if this is remotely possible or if I'm about to commit career suicide. She pulled out her phone and walked a few steps away, leaving Marcello and Kit in their small bubble of tentative possibility. Does this mean I can stay with you? Kit asked, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loud might shatter whatever magic was potentially forming. Marcello wanted to promise yes with absolute certainty, wanted to erase the doubt from those hopeful eyes, but he'd learned long ago that false promises were crueler than honest uncertainty. "We're trying to make it work," he said instead, offering truth rather than platitudes. "But there are rules adults have to follow about these things, and Miss Lindley has to make sure it's safe and proper." Kit nodded with understanding that seemed too mature for his age, accepting complexity most 6-year-olds wouldn't grasp because his life had required early education and bureaucratic disappointment. "At least you're trying," he said, that small voice carrying weight beyond its volume. "Most people don't even try once they find out I'm temporary." The casual acceptance of his own disposability made Marcello want to find every adult who'd taught Kit that lesson and demonstrate exactly why crossing certain lines had permanent consequences. Lindley returned 20 minutes later with an expression that suggested her phone calls had been as complicated as expected. "Okay," she said, the word emerging like surrender after a long battle. "This is highly irregular and probably violates half a dozen protocols I should care more about. But my supervisor agrees that emergency placement with a willing adult beats leaving a child in terminal holding patterns." She looked directly at Marcello, her professional mask fully deployed. "There will be immediate background checks, a home visit within 24 hours, weekly monitoring, and if anything seems remotely concerning, he's removed immediately." "Understood and agreed," Marcello confirmed, accepting terms that would have been unthinkable yesterday when privacy was paramount and uninvited visitors meant danger. His phone buzzed again, the 15th message from associates wondering where he'd disappeared to, and he silenced it without reading, making clear through action where his priorities had shifted. Lindley pulled a tablet from her bag and began entering information, her fingers moving quickly across forms that would initiate processes Marcello couldn't reverse once started. "I need your full legal name, address, date of birth, social security number," Lindley recited, each requirement another piece of armor Marcello was voluntarily removing. He provided the information without hesitation, watching her expression change subtly as she presumably recognized his name from whatever contexts it appeared in public records. "You're Marcello Cray," she said slowly, the statement heavy with implications about exactly who she'd spent the night sharing a VIP lounge with, as in the Cray that owns half the commercial real estate in Manhattan. The recognition was inevitable, though Marcello had hoped it might come later after arrangements were already finalized. "Real estate among other investments," he confirmed, using the bland description that concealed more than it revealed. "Does it matter to the placement?" His challenge was direct. Was she going to let who he was interfere with what Kit needed, or could she separate reputation from present circumstance? Lindley held his gaze for a long moment, some internal calculation taking place behind her eyes. "The background check will show whatever it shows," she said finally. Diplomatic non-answer that suggested she suspected more than real estate, but was choosing to focus on immediate practicalities. "For now, you have no violent criminal record, considerable financial stability, and you've demonstrated care for Kit when you had no obligation to do so." She turned to include Kit in the conversation, recognizing that he deserved agency in decisions about his own placement. "Would you like to stay with Marcello while we find your permanent home?" Kit's face transformed with joy so pure it was almost painful, his entire small body radiating happiness that had been absent during their earlier goodbye. "Yes," he breathed, the single word containing multitudes of hope and relief and gratitude. "Yes, please, Miss Lindley. I promise I'll be really good, and I won't cause any problems." He launched himself at Marcello in another unexpected hug, this one lasting longer than the previous, small arms wrapping around Marcello's waist with the fierceness of someone holding on to salvation. Marcello's arms closed around Kit automatically, feeling the boy's heart racing against his ribs, the physical manifestation of fear transforming into security. Over Kit's head, he met Lindley's eyes and saw her recognition that something significant had just occurred, that this wasn't just emergency placement, but the beginning of something neither adult could quite name yet. "We'll need to stop by my office to finalize paperwork," Lindley said, already moving into practical logistics mode. "And then I'll follow you to your residence for the initial home assessment." The next 2 hours passed in a bureaucratic blur, forms signed in triplicate, emergency placement orders filed with judges Lindley apparently had on speed dial, background check systems queried while they waited. Kit stayed close to Marcello throughout, occasionally reaching to touch his hand or coat like confirming this wasn't a dream that would evaporate. They took a car service to Marcello's building, a high-rise in Tribeca that made Lindley's eyebrows rise despite her professional poker face. and rode the elevator to the penthouse that suddenly felt too large and too impersonal for the small boy about to inhabit it. Lindley conducted her home inspection with thorough efficiency, checking locks and exits and asking questions about childproofing that Marcello answered while mentally cataloging everything that would need to change. Kit explored with the careful reverence of someone in a museum, touching expensive furniture with gentle fingers, staring at the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of the city he'd only ever seen from ground level. "You live here alone?" the boy asked, voice echoing slightly in the vast living space. "It's so big and quiet." "It is," Marcello agreed, seeing his home through Kit's eyes and finding it wanting in warmth despite all its luxury. "But maybe it won't be so quiet anymore." The suggestion made Kit smile, small but genuine, the expression of someone beginning to believe that this latest placement might actually happen. Lindley completed her inspection and pulled Marcello aside while Kit was distracted by the view, her voice low and serious when she spoke. "I'm trusting you with him," she said, intensity radiating from every syllable. "I'm bending rules that exist for very good reasons because the alternatives are worse. But if you hurt him or fail him, or turn out to be anything other than what you're presenting, I will make it my life's mission to ensure appropriate consequences." The threat would have been amusing coming from most people. Marcello had faced down armed rivals without flinching, but Lindley's maternal ferocity made it credible in ways violence never achieved. "I understand," he said simply, respecting her enough not to make jokes or deflect. "And for what it's worth, I have no intention of being another adult who disappoints him." The promise was reckless given his lifestyle, given the empire that required his attention, given everything he was choosing to ignore by taking responsibility for a 6-year-old boy. But watching Kit press his small hand against the window glass, leaving prints he'd apologize for later, Marcello found he meant every word. After Lindley left with promises to return tomorrow for the first follow-up visit, Marcello and Kit stood in the penthouse facing each other with the awkwardness of strangers who'd agreed to cohabitate. The space that had felt like sanctuary during years of solitary existence now seemed excessive and cold, designed for aesthetics rather than living. Kit clutched his dinosaur backpack and Mr. Buttons, looking small against the backdrop of floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture. "So," Marcello said, breaking the silence that had stretched too long, "we should probably figure out where you'll sleep." The guest bedrooms were on the east side of the penthouse, 3 of them pristinely maintained by housekeeping staff who came twice weekly. Marcello led Kit down the hallway, opening doors to reveal rooms that looked more like hotel suites than spaces meant for children. Kit evaluated each room with the serious consideration of someone making an important decision, finally choosing the smallest one because it feels less empty. "We can change anything you want," Marcello found himself saying, looking at the room through Kit's eyes and seeing its deficiencies clearly. The boy's expression suggested this level of personalization was foreign to him, that previous temporary rooms had remained sterile, because investing in decoration meant acknowledging permanence. "Can I put up my drawings?" Kit asked tentatively, gesturing to the backpack where presumably art projects lived between placements. Marcello nodded, watching Kit carefully extract papers from the backpack's front pocket, handling them like precious documents that had survived multiple relocations. The drawings were standard child art, dinosaurs and houses and stick figures, but each one had Kit, age 6, printed carefully in the corner. They taped them to the wall using painter's tape from a drawer in the hallway closet, creating a gallery that transformed the sterile space into something lived in. Mr. Buttons got positioned on the nightstand where he could guard, while Kit slept, the teddy bear's worn face watching over this latest temporary home. The afternoon presented practical challenges Marcello hadn't anticipated. Kit owned exactly what fit in his backpack, which meant 3 changes of clothes and 1 pair of pajamas. "We need to get you proper things," Marcello said, already reaching for his phone to make arrangements. Kit's eyes went wide at the suggestion of shopping, the kind of excitement that suggested retail therapy was rare treat rather than regular occurrence. "Real shopping? Like at a store where I can pick things out?" The questions revealed experiences where clothes appeared in trash bags, pre-selected by adults. They took another car service to a children's store in Soho that Marcello's assistant had recommended, the driver navigating streets still showing evidence of the previous night's storm. Kit pressed his face to the window during the ride, narrating observations about snowplows and salt trucks with enthusiasm. Inside the store, surrounded by options ranging from practical to extravagant, Kit's confidence wavered, overwhelmed by choices after a lifetime of receiving rather than selecting. "Pick what you like," Marcello encouraged, watching the boy touch fabrics with careful fingers, pulling back like he might break something if he chose wrong. A sales associate approached, but Marcello waved her off, recognizing that Kit needed time to process this autonomy. Eventually, the boy gravitated toward clothes featuring dinosaurs, shirts with T-Rexes, pajamas with pterodactyls, a jacket with a triceratops hood. They accumulated bags full of necessities and some luxuries. The dinosaur clothes, plain basics, winter gear that actually fit. Kit kept checking Marcello's face for signs of impatience or regret, the careful monitoring of someone used to overstaying welcome. "This is okay?" he asked repeatedly. "You're sure it's not too much?" His concern about cost was heartbreaking given that Marcello had spent more on single business lunches. Mr. Buttons received his own shopping attention when Kit noticed a display of stuffed animal accessories near the checkout counter. The boy's eyes lit up at tiny clothing items designed for teddy bears, his fingers hovering over a miniature jacket that matched his own new triceratops hooded coat. "Could Mr. Buttons get something too?" Kit asked with careful hesitance, voice dropping as if the request might be pushing his luck too far. Marcello found himself nodding before considering the absurdity of buying designer wear for a threadbare teddy bear, but Kit's joy at selecting matching outfits erased any concern about rational spending priorities. The sales associate returned as they were leaving, handing Marcello a business card for a professional toy restoration service that specialized in repairing beloved childhood companions. "For the bear," she said quietly, her tone suggesting she'd witnessed enough family shopping trips to recognize the difference between new toys and irreplaceable treasures. Kit clutched the packages containing Mr. Button's new wardrobe, with the same reverence he'd shown the teddy bear itself, already planning aloud how they'd coordinate outfits for different occasions. Marcello listened to this enthusiastic monologue about fashion choices for stuffed animals and realized his life had fundamentally shifted in ways that business strategies and territory negotiations had never prepared him for. "It's not too much," Marcello assured him. "You need clothes, and it's my responsibility to provide them now." The word responsibility seemed to settle something in Kit's mind, reframing the shopping as obligation rather than charity. They added toiletries and a new backpack shaped like a stegosaurus that Kit selected after long deliberation between various dinosaur options. They returned to the penthouse loaded with bags, Kit insisting on carrying as many as his small arms could manage, determined to contribute to his own relocation. The guest room, now officially Kit's room, got transformed through strategic placement of new possessions, the space slowly becoming recognizable as child's territory. Dinosaur pajamas went in drawers. The Stegosaurus backpack claimed a corner. New shoes lined up in the closet next to clothes still bearing tags. "Are you hungry?" Marcello asked, realizing they'd skipped lunch and dinner was approaching, his own stomach making demands he'd been ignoring. Kit nodded enthusiastically, the boy's appetite apparently unlimited when food security was guaranteed rather than rationed. Marcello's kitchen was professional grade but mostly unused, his meals typically catered or eaten at restaurants where business happened over appetizers. They ordered pizza from a place Marcello's assistant swore was kid-friendly, adding breadsticks and salad to create something resembling balanced nutrition. While waiting for delivery, Kit explored the penthouse more thoroughly, discovering the library that Marcello rarely used, the gym equipment that saw sporadic attention. "You have a lot of computers," Kit observed, looking at the multiple monitors displaying information Marcello quickly minimized. Kit wandered to the windows and pressed his palm against the glass, leaving a small handprint that Marcello's housekeeper would have immediately cleaned yesterday, but now felt like evidence of life worth preserving. "The city looks different from up here," the boy observed, watching traffic move like toy cars far below, lights beginning to flicker on as evening settled over Manhattan. "Like we're above everything, safe in the sky." The metaphor was more poetic than Marcello expected from a 6-year-old, but then Kit had probably learned early to find safety in height and distance, in being removed from ground-level dangers that followed children through unstable systems. The pizza arrived and they ate at the dining table that hadn't hosted an actual meal in months, Marcello typically eating at his desk while working. Kit demonstrated impressive capacity for cheese-covered carbohydrates, consuming 3 slices before finally slowing down. He chattered between bites about dinosaur facts. Apparently Stegosaurus had brain the size of walnut. Despite its large body, velociraptors were actually turkey-sized rather than movie-sized. After dinner, the reality of bedtime presented new challenges that Marcello hadn't fully considered. Kit had a routine involving bath, teeth brushing, story time, and gradual dimming of lights while soft music played. Marcello had none of these provisions prepared. No children's books. No understanding of appropriate bathing protocols for small humans. "We'll improvise," he said with more confidence than he felt, leading Kit to the guest bathroom attached to his new room. The bath was accomplished with Kit handling most aspects himself, demonstrating independence that suggested he'd learned early not to expect help with personal care. Storytime proved more challenging without actual children's books, but Kit produced a library book from his backpack, one about turtles learning to fly. "Miss Linley checked this out for me," he explained, handling it carefully. "It's due back in 5 days." Marcello read with surprising engagement, finding himself invested in whether the reptile would achieve flight despite aerodynamic impossibility. He stood in the doorway watching Kit sleep, this small person who'd appeared in his life less than 24 hours ago and somehow rearranged everything. The rational part of his mind cataloged all the ways this was mistake, the danger his lifestyle posed to innocent bystanders, the impossibility of maintaining his empire while providing stable guardianship. But another part, one that had been dormant so long he'd forgotten it existed, whispered that maybe this was exactly what both of them needed. The first week with Kit transformed Marcello's existence in ways he hadn't anticipated, routine adjustments cascading into fundamental life restructuring. Morning meetings got rescheduled to accommodate school drop-off. Kit was enrolled in the local elementary school with paperwork that Marcello's lawyer expedited through channels that didn't bear close examination. The boy adapted with resilience that spoke to practice, navigating new classroom and playground politics with the survival skills children in unstable situations developed. Teachers called him quiet but attentive, making friends slowly but genuinely, the kind of kid who observed before trusting. Marcello found himself leaving the office at reasonable hours, unprecedented departure from the 16-hour days that had been standard for years. His associates noticed, but didn't comment directly, communicating their confusion through raised eyebrows and significant glances that Marcello ignored with the authority of someone who didn't owe explanations. Evenings developed their own rhythm. Homework at the dining table, dinner that Marcello learned to cook through trial and considerable error, reading time that expanded Kit's library from one book to dozens, the penthouse filled with evidence of child habitation, toys creeping into living spaces despite Marcello's initial attempts at containment. Linley visited weekly for monitoring appointments, her professional skepticism gradually transforming into something like cautious approval. "He's thriving," she admitted during the 3rd week, watching Kit demonstrate his latest Lego creation, an elaborate dinosaur habitat spanning the coffee table. "More stable than I've seen him in any placement, which is either testament to your commitment or proof you're good at hiding problems." Her suspicion never fully disappeared. Healthy wariness about the man whose background check had revealed precisely what she'd suspected, plus some details that probably violated federal disclosure laws. "I'm not hiding anything," Marcello said, which was technically true within the narrow context of his guardianship of Kit, even if broadly false regarding his business operations. "He needs stability, and I can provide it." What he didn't mention was how Kit had become priority that superseded territory disputes and profit margins. How Marcello found himself making decisions through the filter of, how does this affect Kit, that fundamentally altered his risk calculations. Associates who used to get immediate responses now waited hours while Marcello attended school events and doctor appointments, his empire adjusting to accommodate this new variable. The relationship between Marcello and Linley evolved beyond professional monitoring into something neither quite knew how to categorize. She started arriving early for appointments, staying late after inspections were complete, joining them for dinners that stretched into conversations about Kit's progress and larger questions about childhood development. Marcello found himself appreciating her directness, the way she challenged his assumptions and called out his occasional parenting missteps without sugarcoating criticism. She saw through his carefully constructed facades, but chose to engage with the person underneath rather than the reputation that preceded him. "You're good with him," Linley observed one evening after Kit had gone to bed, the two of them sitting in Marcello's living room with coffee that had gone cold during conversation. "Better than people with years of preparation and training. It's like you understand what he needs before he asks." Her tone carried curiosity rather than accusation, genuine interest in how someone from Marcello's background had developed these instincts. He considered deflecting, but found he wanted her to understand, wanted someone to see the connections he'd made between his own childhood and Kit's present. "I was him," Marcello said simply, the confession emerging easier than expected. Different specifics, same fundamentals, unwanted kid bouncing between places that didn't want him, learning to make himself useful or invisible depending on what survival required. He watched emotions shift across Linley's face as understanding clicked into place, context that explained his immediate connection with Kit that first night. So I know what helps because I know what hurt, what I needed that nobody provided. The admission was more vulnerable than he typically allowed, but something about Linley made honesty feel less dangerous than usual. She reached across the space between them and touched his hand briefly, the gesture communicating understanding that went beyond words. "That's why you took him in," she said. Not quite question, but inviting confirmation. Not charity or impulse, but recognition. Marcello nodded, finding relief in being understood without needing to explain further. Something shifted in that moment, professional boundaries blurring into personal territory, as they acknowledged mutual investment in Kit's well-being that had become foundation for their own connection. The air between them felt charged with possibility neither was quite ready to name. 3 months into the placement, Kit's case file moved from emergency temporary to longer-term foster, paperwork that required additional background scrutiny and home studies that Linley conducted with thorough professionalism that occasionally slipped into lingering glances at Marcello. The permanent family search continued theoretically, but everyone seemed to recognize that Kit had already found his place, that disrupting this stability would serve bureaucracy rather than the child's best interests. Marcello initiated conversations with his lawyer about permanent adoption, process that would require revealing more about his life than he'd ever voluntarily disclosed, but Kit's future felt worth the exposure. Christmas approached, almost a year since that snowy night in Grand Central Terminal, and Marcello found himself experiencing the holiday for first time in years as something other than obligation to endure. Kit wanted a tree, decorations, the full celebration he'd seen in movies but rarely experienced in temporary placements. They selected a massive evergreen that barely fit in the penthouse, decorating it with ornaments Kit chose during shopping expedition that took entire Saturday. The boy hung each ornament with ceremonial care, explaining where it should go and why, creating traditions in real time that Marcello found himself committed to repeating annually. The penthouse transformed under Kit's influence, no longer sterile showcase but actual home, with evidence of life in every room. School artwork covered the refrigerator, dinosaur toys claimed corners, Mr. Buttons, professionally repaired and looking almost new, held place of honor on the living room bookshelf. Marcello's associates, who occasionally visited for business meetings, did double takes at the domestic evidence, confusion about how the feared Marcello Cray had become person who owned stepping stools for sink reaching and refrigerator magnets shaped like triceratops. He offered no explanations, letting them reconcile the contradiction on their own. On Christmas Eve, Linley joined them for dinner, the invitation extended casually but accepted with enthusiasm that suggested this had become important tradition for her too. She brought gifts for Kit, books about paleontology, and a stuffed stegosaurus to keep Mr. Buttons company, and a bottle of wine for Marcello that they shared after Kit went to bed. They sat by the decorated tree with its lights casting patterns across the room, comfortable silence between them that spoke to months of growing familiarity. "Thank you," Marcello said finally, the words inadequate for what he was trying to express. "For trusting me with him when you had every reason not to." Linley smiled, her expression soft in the tree's glow. "You saved each other," she said simply, wisdom that came from watching their relationship develop from professional distance that had gradually narrowed. That night in the terminal when he asked if anyone came with you, you were both lost, and somehow that made you exactly right for finding each other. Marcello couldn't argue with her assessment, had come to similar conclusions during 3 a.m., moments when he checked on Kit sleeping, and marveled at how this child had anchored him to life in ways nothing else had managed. "I think I'm falling in love with you," Marcello heard himself admit, the confession emerging without plan or preparation, just truth that had been building through months of shared parenting and late-night conversations. Linley's eyes widened, but she didn't pull away, didn't laugh or reject the vulnerability he'd offered. Instead, she leaned closer, closing the distance between them until their faces were inches apart, her breath warm against his lips. "I think I've been falling for a while," she whispered, then kissed him with gentle intensity that promised beginnings rather than endings. They pulled apart when Kit's voice called from his bedroom, some nightmare or need pulling him awake. Both adults responded automatically, moving together toward his room where they found him sitting up clutching Mr. Buttons, wide-eyed but not crying. "I had a dream about the train station," he said, voice small in the darkness. But it was different this time. You were both there and nobody was lost. Marcello and Linley exchanged glances over Kit's head, wordless communication about what this child had given them beyond themselves. 6 months later, on a summer afternoon that felt decades removed from that winter storm, Marcello returned to Grand Central Terminal with Kit and Linley, the three of them arriving together rather than separately and alone. They'd come to celebrate finalization of Kit's adoption, paperwork signed that made permanent what had felt inevitable for months. Kit wore his favorite dinosaur shirt and carried Mr. Buttons, leading them to the bench where he'd first asked Marcello that dangerous question about coming alone. "This is where we found each other," he announced, patting the wooden slats like greeting an old friend. They sat together on that bench, Marcello in the middle with Kit on one side and Linley on the other, forming unit that looked like family because that's what they'd become. Travelers rushed past on their way to trains and departures, everyone focused on destinations rather than journey, missing the small miracle of 3 people who'd been lost separately and found each other in the cold. Kit leaned against Marcello's side, that same trusting weight from a year ago, but now familiar rather than foreign, belonging that had been earned through daily choice rather than biological obligation. "Are we still looking for something?" Kit asked, echoing his question from that first night but with different meaning now, checking whether their search had ended or continued. Linley took Marcello's hand, lacing their fingers together while her other arm wrapped around Kit's shoulders, completing the circle. "No, buddy," she said softly, her voice carrying certainty that came from experience rather than hope. "We're not looking anymore. We already found what we needed." Kit nodded, satisfied with this answer, and settled more comfortably against them, while above their heads the painted constellations watched over thousands of daily dramas, including this small one about 3 people who'd been alone until they weren't. The terminal's afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, catching dust motes that danced in golden beams, making everything look soft and possible. Marcello thought about the man he'd been a year ago, desperately boarding trains to nowhere, running from connection instead of toward it, existing rather than living. That person felt like stranger now, someone who'd needed a 6-year-old's wisdom to remember that being lost and being alone weren't permanent conditions, that sometimes salvation arrived in forms you'd never anticipated, wearing dinosaur backpacks and asking dangerous questions. He pulled both Kit and Linley closer, 3 heartbeats synchronizing in the chaos of Grand Central Terminal, where endings and beginnings happened simultaneously for those brave enough to notice. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you these stories of hope, connection, and unexpected family. Remember, sometimes the people who are meant to find each other will always find their way back, no matter how lost they started. Until next time, take care of each other.